Have you ever been refused a visa for any country, including the UK?
Welcome, Nadia and Timo. I think it's probably interesting to start with the beginning, since maybe for those who are not very familiar with your work, it involves many times a practice that is quite site-specific, and you often work in a very tactile manner, whether it's about archiving imprints from certain locations, walls, or excavating what's underneath paint, as you did for the project in the Mosaic Rooms, what's underneath the building, so quite historical as well, trying to archive that. No, it's the first time you've actually worked with film, so I was quite interested in asking you about that experience of working with the medium of film, but also about the process of where did you film, who are the people you actually brought together in this particular piece, so maybe we can start with that.
You started by saying that I have a tactile approach and usually working a lot with prints, and it's true that this is the first time that I work with a video, with a film, but still it is in the same logic, in the sense that when you take a print, you take something from the world, a piece that you select, and you show it in a particular way. So this is also what we did with the video now, in the sense that we took the inquiry, the questionnaire that you have to fill when you want to travel to the UK as a tourist, for a tourist visa. So that is the contact to the reality somehow. And as for the experience of the video, it wasn't that different from the other works, in the sense that I experiment very much with the medium, and almost every time is something completely different. So I really throw myself into a technique that I don't know, and dig and discover. I was very lucky to work with a very good cameraman with whom Timo worked in the past, and with an amazing sound technician who is an artist, actually, works with the sound. Stefan Roig. And so the quality on that sense was guaranteed, so I was somehow on the safe side. We filmed in two different locations. We filmed in Berlin, the mouth, and we filmed the church in Tunis. Obviously the church is an Anglican church situated in the core of the old Medina of Tunis, and the people who you saw present are mostly my friends. Some of the people who are in the back side, they are people used to come to the church, so Tunisian Christians, very rare in Tunisia, and the others were Muslims. Actually, it happened that way because at the time when we filmed, there was some stress happening in the city, in the country generally, with the Salafists.
This is just after the uprising?
Not completely after, so we filmed in 2012, a year after, and the priester asked us to be sure of every person who comes, so it had to be really people that we know and who we trusted. But it was very important for us to know that they were all Tunisians, so potentially they could ask for a visa to the UK. If they want to come to the UK, they would have to answer these questions. We would have to go through this process.
And this is, of course, a process you have to go through yourself many times if you want to enter the UK.
Yeah, every time.
And that was also the original source of inspiration, this arduous visa application.
That's the thing. It was a biographical. The idea came from a situation that we lived. I mean, I lived first, but since we lived together, we discussed.
I lived it.
But actually, he lives it more than me, Timo, because he's so kind to. I don't have the patience. So he does.
I do the visa applications.
That's true. I don't have the patience. I mean, the first one, that one I did, but then later now you do, because every time Rachel, the Mosaic Room, had to take me a lawyer this time to come here. And I came here because I'm married to a German guy. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be able to do the show. But this is not the issue why we're here. That's why I wanted to make it humoristic, because I think it's much stronger to bring pointing critiques about social dysfunctionments somehow through humor rather than sitting and complaining. So,
and in the beginning we started to laugh when we we just went together through the inquiry form, and each question was even worse than the
Actually, the best one is the last. That's why I wanted really that we insist on the last one, because the last one is really surrealistic almost. So it asks you approximately if you think you are a person of a good character.
Yes. So it's any sign that you might not be a
person of good character. That's
so it's very polite. The formulation is very polite. So and you might not be, for not to say that you are not.
We filmed, of course, to go to the United States. I filmed something similar. But they don't have this hilarious question.
Oh, they
the last one.
This is quite interesting. For the United States, they are much more objective and more scientific, rationalized and scientificized. So they ask you for the diseases that you already had.
Yeah. It's much more disease.
Are there any signs that some viruses?
Yeah, and so actually while I was filming it for the first time, that was in 2010, I think, I was invited to come here for a talk, and I missed my talk because it took so much time, much more than normal, over 1 month and a half. And for this process, I have to send my passport to the UK, so which makes me not able to move for over 1 month and a half. I have to stay in Berlin. And the whole thing inspired somehow this video. Yeah, we started singing it actually.
Yes,
that's how the first chanting, the first step to the church and to the liturgy came from that.
Yeah, we needed to put it in a form somehow, because it was the answer is always the same answer. So if you just mark yes one time, I'm sure you won't get a visa. So it's just to make sure who you are not, and not to find out who you are.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't really experienced it as it should be installed, but what I find really interesting display-wise is that it's very dialogic, of course, in its aesthetics and its concept, but also on the one hand you pit this faceless uniform and voice of the border control of authority vis-a-vis the collective group that is singing.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you can talk a bit about this idea of individual subjectivity that is being erased, and this one voice, and then this one faceless voice of authority that's this very monotonous voice.
We decided to keep only the mouth, because in this process you don't have a person that you see. You have first the computer, internet, and then you go and give your passport and all your documents to someone in a private agency, which is not the UK border agency. So you literally don't see anyone from the UK border agency, and you can never explain your specific case. So the whole process is faceless somehow, and you really do feel small and helpless.
Or the other side appears like a
super power, especially that you hand your passport. And in the case for my country, Tunisia, I don't know exactly for the others, but I think there's something similar procedure. It is written inside of my passport that is forbidden for me to send my passport anywhere. I have always to keep it with me, and the passport doesn't belong to me. It's also written it's belong to the authority of Tunisia. So by sending my passport, because it's the only way to get the visa, I am breaking the Tunisian law already. So in case my passport is lost, it's not really evident that I call my embassy and tell them, I send my passport you're not supposed to send in the first place. There would be so the whole time you're sitting and you're like, my God, apart that I hope to get my visa, but mostly what I hope is not to get, that my passport gets lost. So this is also this somehow this power thing where you're doing something very legal to travel to another country, in my case invited for a talk, or even if you want to visit, but then you have to go through this humiliating process of being so like asked about questions completely hilarious with genocide and whatever, and then this other thing with really risking to, because the risk is real. If you know the people who bring you the passport, it's also not an official institution, it's a private person who just to earn some money brings
it's a private courier.
It
was not FedEx or
so there's no guarantee, literally, like there's no guarantee that you get your documents back.
And another thing is that the whole process, or the UK border agency in this arrangement, appears a little bit Kafkaesque. Like there's the castle from Kafka. It reminded me a little bit this novel where there's this landscaping guy working for the castle, but there's no contact with his with someone from the castle, and he doesn't see the castle because there's no visual castle in the town. So with the UK border agency, it was a little bit like this. There is a website, and this website changes regulations all the time. So we did several visas in the last years, and each time there was a new regulation of documents, what you have to provide and everything.
No, that's worse. They tell you can provide the documents that you think are relevant.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to say.
So
in the end, there's no contact. There's no other side you can, no person you can interact with. It's just you should provide everything that you want the UK border agency know about you.
You don't know what they want.
Actually, we don't want the UK border agency to know anything about us, but you should provide. And
that's why the lawyer was helpful.
Yeah, and this is like this anonymous power that make you deliver even if you don't want to. You just want to get into this country, and to get into this country you must change your behavior.
And then there is this opposition, or let's say this tension between the faceless mouth and quite a crowd, not huge but still a crowd, who the screen is also bigger, but you can still feel the powers on which side, as a spectator who is in between.
And to actually elaborate a little bit on that, why did you insist on having this collective voice actually answering?
This collective voice, because it's something that I guess it concerns so many people who, it's not only my case. The situation seems so crazy, but everyone who is not from the United States or the European Union or Australia, like there are exceptions, all the rest have to go through this process. But I must say that it's for the people who live elsewhere from their country, it's more complicated. If I was in Tunisia, it would have been much easier than for me as a Tunisian living in Germany. It's still another case. It's a bit more complicated.
It's a worst case scenario when you live with a non-EU citizenship passport in an EU country.
Also wanted to ask you whether it came as something extremely logical to bring the institutions of the state and the ecclesiastical institution together, you know, because of course both work quite normative. The church also historically conditioning society, UK or other border patrol agencies conditioning the entry into certain societies, right? So it's a geographical control also of behavior. So was that like something you thought of, I mean, immediately, like we'll bring these two together?
I don't think it was immediate. All of the because the history of the church brings many layers that we will discuss now. But what immediately came is this chanting. And
that was therapeutic, right? The chanting
somehow,
for you guys.
And this came quickly, like that we put ourselves in the situation of probably a liturgy or something religious. But the church, from the African point of view, because it's about the immigrants that come from Africa, in this case Tunisia, they immigrate to Europe and seeing it as the Christian continent, and they look at this continent with hope, hoping that it will be somehow better. But also the nave of the church represents symbolically the Arch of Noé, so the ship that will save also the humanity. And the lot of immigrants, as we all know, the unfortunate stories, travel from Africa, the illegal immigrants from Africa to Europe through the ships that fall. And but there's also this doorkeeping, the doorkeeper, the gatekeeper. The church is the gatekeeper between heaven and earth, or hell, something in between. And
the Catholic Church between heaven and hell.
Oh no, this is the Orthodox. My mom is Orthodox. It's the same. I don't think it's only Catholic religion, let's say. And then also the idea of we said the nave.
The Holy Inquisition.
Yeah, the Inquisition, the inquiry. That it, like in this case, you don't know who is going to give you the visa and on which terms is the choice going to be really made. And this recalls somehow this Inquisition where you are in front of a jury, but you almost have no chance actually, because it's not objective measures on which you're going to be judged.
Yeah, and on the level of the institution, there's a contradiction, because this secular power of border control agency is seeking for a no. So they're just asking, and they're waiting for the no. So the no is their positive result. And in the Inquisition, it was the other way around. They were pushing towards a yes. So you have to confess, you are a witch, or you are a heretic.
Heretic,
yeah. So this opposite position was also interesting in this symbolic.
Yeah, but I guess it's also very much about identity, that here you're actually forced to express identity in the negative all the time.
And it's not an identity at all.
Yeah.
It's just about who you are not.
Yeah.
So and maybe this is what modern states want the people to be. Nobody's. Just not that, not that, not that, not that, and you're fine. So the question of identity is, since it is a really cultural specific question, I think it's a little bit. It doesn't really fit to the systems of control in modern states. As identity doesn't matter.
I think there's two other works in the exhibition that also draw on ideas of identity and invisibility and control. That's along the Watchtower and Faces. So maybe we can talk a little bit about these two projects and start perhaps with Faces.
Yeah, Faces was inspired by the history of the building, as Rachel has very nicely introduced in the beginning. To make the show, we started to dig into the history of the building, which is called the Tower House, hosting the Mosaic Rooms. And particularly what was interesting for us was the Greater Britain exhibition in 1899. And within this exhibition there was a show which was called Savage South Africa, and for which 174 South Africans were brought here, and they were presented in this savage South Africa, the way the colonials imagined them to be at that time, because nothing corresponded to reality actually. After doing the research, archival research, we realized that these people, most of them were minors, that they were very well educated, spoke many languages, and they just did their job. It was a performance for them. They agreed to come in order to perform for money. And but the way they were presented, putting them in a group and wearing these weird clothes as if it is Zulu, there were many supposed to be groups from Zulu, Matabele, and Swazi. And
Mashona.
In the middle of the Zulu, for example, they had imagined a prince who apparently was not the prince, but it was all like a kind of a scenery. We thought probably it's a kind of a propaganda. It was Cecil Rhodes who has financed the whole show. And
Cecil Rhodes, at this time, he was a head and the owner of the Chelchard Company, which was the biggest mining company in the British Empire. And he triggered the Zulu Wars in 1894, I'm not quite sure about this date, 1893, 94. And it came to several killings of pioneer farmers in the colonial territories. And people, the authorities and the public in London got quite critical about Cecil Rhodes, because they knew that he triggered this. So he delivered arms in this region. He wanted to ignite a revolt of the Boers against the colonial government, and so he was quite pushing towards that he could get into these territories for mining. And so the London public discredited Cecil Rhodes as greedy mining mogul, and he wanted to show that the killings was not because of his interventions. The killings was because of the South Africans are so savage, cruel and savage. And this was why he was the only one who sponsored and financed the whole event, because the British colonial government was against it, and they even tried to restore a kind of allowance that this crew could leave South Africa, this South African colonial colonies at this time. And then Cecil Rhodes, he hired a private company, and the private boat, the Goth, that did it in the end. So he put really much money in it.
And the whole exhibition was, of course, a whole exercise in a particular form of visual representation, which in your project you actually
tried to break
around
somehow.
Yes.
Yeah, so all of what was in this kind of mediatic way, the South Africans were presented like a savage group, and in this way of presenting them, it felt as if their personality, their faces were taken away. And what we did is actually go back to a kind of a tradition of when the photography was, the beginnings of the photography. It was very expensive to develop the plates at that time, so families, when they wanted to have the pictures of their beloved, what they did was to take a group photography of the whole family, and then they would cut around the portraits, often in an oval form, and then develop them. And this is basically we did in a very similar way. We took the archival images. We tried to find the best scans that we could have, which we found, thank Rachel, in South Africa. A lot of this is really thanks the research that Rachel did for us. And so we really cut, of course, with the new media that we have today, the faces, the portraits, and then we developed them a little bit larger, but still in this family format.
Yes.
Not too big, just to keep it as if it's a family thing, and then framed them and presented them in the Passepartout oval, really in a very traditional Victorian portrait gallery. So if you come to the exhibition, you see make the tour around the particular faces like in a portrait gallery. And we didn't present them all, of course. It's only a selection from the material that we were able to find.
Yes, and it's quite interesting that most probably our visual understanding is so much trained to understand oval portrait of individual as a characteristic image, and you get in you try to understand this person. You see a person. You don't see a motley group of weird-looking guys. You just see someone into his eyes, and then there's a contact somehow. And it was quite interesting when we did this. We did also the research, old newspaper articles and these kind of things. And it was interesting that the Greater Britain exhibition was covered in international media. So pretty much media from the United States, pretty much media from Europe, the continental Europe. So there have been Dutch media, German, French, English, and in some articles the reporter mentioned that these savage South Africans speak a really well and elaborated English. And not only English, they can also fluently answer to French journalists and Dutch journalists and German journalists. And then we read more and more and more, and we read the study of an historian, Ben Shepherd, who is South African and who worked on this, and he found out that Frank Phillis, a showman from South Africa, he actually casted these. He casted them as professional actors, and
they are pretty good looking.
They're really handsome.
And then they had a lot of success with the late English ladies.
Of course, and they
also discovered through the researchers.
And some of them became even celebrities here in London, they were actors. They acted their roles in a spectacle, and this spectacle was a propaganda spectacle because it recalled or reconstructed the Zulu Wars. Mm-hmm. So, but on a really subjective view. So it's their salary was quite high, so they got really good artist fees in London. So they lived from bars and restaurants. So they did not. They have no need to cook. They could live from restaurants and bars and cafes, and they really enjoyed time, most probably, except some racist things that happened also, which is reported in some newspapers. But then I must say that their choice was at this time in the Rand region in South Africa was either you go to the mining under the earth and you work the whole day under the earth and work and you live in a labor camp of 7 roads, where you cannot get out, and it's like a prison, so you can get in your labor camp in the evening after work, stroll around inside of the fence, and then in the morning you get under the earth the whole day, which was not really interesting. And then they got the possibility to go to London and do a show. And of course, Frank Phillis, he had to choose. So he selected the best fitting actors. And many more wanted to join.
What I think is also really interesting in this project is that you almost incorporate a double decontextualization. Like on the one hand, these men and these actors were brought here and it was completely stripped from the context they were actually living in. And then what you do in the photograph and how you present is again taking away the context and actually presenting them as subjects.
Mm.
Yes. So when all the context that you get from the books and from the archives becomes more plausible, understandable when you
look at their faces.
Yeah.
Individual faces. And when you only have this group photo,
it's just a mise en scène.
But then you cannot see the individual characters, and when you learn more about the historical context of this, there's a tension between what you see, the group photo, and what you learn from the archives.
Mm-hmm. I think what's also interesting in No is we spoke about this a little bit earlier about this this ghost-like presence of the voice of authority. And that's also very prevalent in the project along the Watchtower, which we're also showing at the Mosaic Rooms. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. All along the Watchtower, probably it's another form for this invisible authority that controls in different ways. I would say monitors, looks at you, but you don't know when and how and in which situation. So basically what you can see if you come to the exhibition, the first part of the exhibition, which is the future we want, you would see a huge shadow on the floor and the walls. I'm revealing too much. But you don't see the source, the object, just the shadow. And it is a very realistic shadow in a sense that a lot of people do really look at think where does the shadow comes from. And this awkward questioning of not knowing if it's a real shadow, and if yes, where does the source come from, and if it's no, how come it's there and it looks that way. I wanted it to be similar to what we probably feel when we are on the web, for example, and we would be starting to change our comportement, our behavior, because we might think that probably at a certain point a data can be collected and put somewhere and we don't have a hand on it and something like that. This being said, the work was produced in 2012 before the declarations of Snowden, so I didn't know that the massive surveillance was so massive and going everywhere, but still there was this fear that in a hyper-capitalistic society or a hyper-consumed society like ours, there's a certain point where there's probably kind of a switch from human to animal, in the sense that our consumed behavior is being also collected. There's a data which is collected, and then there are kind of computer simulated programs that treat our data and information in a certain way to know how we will probably in the future consume. And this kind of putting us in an efficiency model recalls for me how we also treat animals to produce more meat and what we should give them to eat and which condition, etc. So that's why it's called the work All Along the Watchtower, but the shadow is the cast of a hunting stand. And the function of the hunting stand is similar to that of the Watchtower, in the sense that the hunting stand is supposed to protect the forest and the animals, but through it animals get killed. And also the Watchtower is supposed to control the borders and the frontiers, but people get killed at the end. It also they look physically, like visually, they look similar. And so this work plays on this frontier about visible, invisible, this awkward feeling that you are not really in the right place, probably.
And the interesting thing is that this term of protection is quite interesting in this context, because there's somewhere a judge who's taking the decision how it should be and how it should not be. You know, it's what we have with no. You should not do have any traffic offenses, or you should not encourage other people in terrorist acts. These kind of things. And in the forest, it's the same thing. There is a deer, but this deer is looking weak or something. It should not stay. So it got shot. And the other deer have a certain number. A group should have this size, but not more. So somewhere is creating a certain knowledge that gives the idea this is good like this, and if it's not like this, we must intervene somehow. We have to kill some animals or get And the same thing is in modern society as well. It runs like this. It's fine like this, but when it comes to this or this, we must intervene. It cannot. let it go.
But this idea of a ghost-like presence or an absent presence, as in the case of Along the Watchtower, is probably something that comes back in your work quite regularly in different shapes and forms. I'm thinking of the imprints that you're taking from walls, which somehow is also the archiving of certain presences, but also a project that's shown at the Mosaic Rooms, the Tunisian Americans, which is in a very different way trying to archive ghosts, actually, but also deals with mobility and geographies and territory in a very different way, actually. So maybe we can actually dwell a little bit on that project.
I always like to come back to the way how Timo decided to put the two works, Faces and Tunisian Americans. And here it's interesting how the works sometimes they communicate between each other without when we were thinking of the works separately, but there is real communication between both. So just shortly come back to Faces. While doing we go back to Tunisian Americans. By face, it's all about Earth, African Earth.
And Faces are looking at Tunisian Americans.
Yeah, this is it. But in both cases, where the strong common ground is the African Earth. And while doing the research about Faces, we digged somehow into their mythology and religion and metaphysics somehow. Realized that for the Zulus, religiously, it's very important to be linked to the earth, because they believe that their ancestors are linked to the earth. So it's quite a taboo to leave their hometown and their place because of this links to the ancestors. And the ancestors are really part of their everyday life. It's not like they can intervene directly in their lives, because they believe that the people who die, they don't disappear, but they still are in a form of living deads. And as long as there is someone who still remembers them, recalls their name, or still knows about them, they cannot completely go to the past and disappear from our world. They are still present. And as present, they can really, for example, if something happens bad to someone, he would think, oh, this is my uncle who is not happy about me, and so it's, in a sense, it's very concrete, active presence. Whereas in the Western world, the memory of the people we love and the memory of the dead, it's a completely different sense. If you die, you're gone in a completely, and it's not linked to the earth. So the two works who are together, the Tunisian Americans, it's basically a work with 4 type cases containing bottles, and each bottle has some earth in it from the cemetery, from the American cemetery in Tunis. And this cemetery is the memorial for the American soldiers who fell in North Africa during the Second World War. And these called Tunisian Americans, because these Americans, since they mixed with the Tunisian earth, became somehow Tunisian, they are looking at faces. But I like this silent dialogue between the two, because the Zulus, like it's imagine what we said the other day, an African imperialism, because of this link to the earth. Whereas in the case of the Tunisian Americans, these American cemeteries, they are spread all over the world, and in the past and during the Second World War, etc. And this is a process that is continuing. The American government diffuses the soldiers in different countries for different reasons. So there's this kind of
mixing going on.
And this control thing is also a way of how to represent history, because Nadia chooses all type cases because she noticed in Germany or in other German-speaking countries there is this habit, or tradition is too much, but it's more a habit, a way how people are used to do. They give children small old type cases, and today these type cases are not from the printing industry, no leftovers, they are produced furnitures. So it's that common that they produce these type cases today for children to put tiny little things and fetishes in there. and just to organize space or to keep everything tidy. But in the end, it's I had a typecase in my childhood, for instance. So, and it was, I remember my mother, she was always angry when these tiny things were strolling around, and she said, "Put it in your typecase, put it in there." And then I put it in there and totally forgot that I have it. It's just you put things in there and then it's gone. And this was interesting in
the parallel with the memorial.
Yeah, in the context of the war memorial. So when you see the context of history, the Americans came in 1941 in the winter, and the North African campaign lasted until 1942 in spring. So in this short time, so many thousand Americans died, American soldiers, and they started her engagement in the Second World War like, okay, now we end this and we liberate Europe and we do something like this. So they started already at the victors, and they ended also like the victor. And but anyway, in this short period of time, a few months, 3,824 American soldiers died, and another 4,700 soldiers are missed in North Africa. So it was quite a disaster. And the idea was not like today in the war, we know today that the fallen soldier is carried back to the United States, and then he's buried in the United States to enable the relatives to mourn, at least on the grave. Now at this time it was a mass war, and the US government just decided to take a piece of Tunisian land. They Americanized this, so it became like the territory of the embassy, American ground in the middle of Tunisia, with an American gardener who take care of it all the time. And it looks like America.
It's like an alien piece of land.
Although it is
within Tunisia,
next to Carthage. So when you are on the cemetery, you feel like somewhere in America, and when you get out of it, you feel like in Tunisia.
It's a very
it's really
strange feeling, actually.
And
especially that they all look alike, the memorials everywhere in the world, as green, and the tombs, they have this white cross.
But in the end, it's like they put the fallen soldier there, and they don't give the possibility to the relatives to go to the grave and mourn. So it's, I think there are but a few families who made the travel to go to these graves. And it's, I learned that you can call the gardener or write an email and ask for putting flowers at the grave. So it's quite...
It's true, we noticed that there are many graves with flowers.
Yeah, it's a service that you can order it. You can, but it doesn't work actually. It's not like the tradition of mourning. And this is so deterritorialized with a really private and subjective need. And in the African mythology, so we went through some structural studies who put all possible African mythologies, which are so different and so so rich in many in terms of the history of ideas. The structural analysts put them all together, and they just came up with some common grounds. And this common grounds is a connection to the earth. And this is why Nadia said African imperialism wouldn't be possible somehow, not in the context of African mythology and philosophies. Also, it's more than a mythology. It's
philosophy, because they have a very interesting conception of time, notion of time, very different from the Western, which is more linked into the present and opening on the past and on almost neglecting the future. Whereas our vision is linked from the present to the future, and the past is...
So actually, we read a lot about it, but I must say I did not get it. I did not understand it because I was always connecting in these 3 time horizons we know. I was always connecting this past, present, future. And when you do this, you're already lost. You cannot do this. So,
I think we should see whether there are any questions from the audience for you at this stage. How are we doing for time? Well, what I think is also really interesting is that in these grids that you have made with the little bottles of soil, you also have registered the service number of the soldiers, the American soldiers who fell in Tunisia. Yeah. So, I mean, what's interesting is that on the one hand, it evokes so many different associations. It's a memorial, a temporary memorial on the one hand. It's extracting soil on the other hand. But it's almost as if it's a souvenir as well, in terms of having something that's material, that's linked to a certain place, and is taken away from that place. But also a souvenir in terms of a memory as well. So it draws on very different...
There's another element that I often forget about this work, the idea of the bottle and putting the soil in it. It's this romantic vision of the Masbah in Arabic. We say, you know, when you from Saladin, when you do this, and there is this,
the genie from the bottle
genie will come. So there is almost a risk that if you open and you know there's something that could, it's not there, but it's just this.
You don't. Don't be afraid.
No, it's not there. It means that it's not in the work. This idea is also not in the work. It's just an extension of this. Because the bottles themselves, they actually contain coal. I took the typical bottles for
kohol, the makeup,
the kohol, which is earth in itself. It's just a particular stone. So there are these micro references, I would say, who this mixture of they become Tunisian somehow. The soil becomes Tunisian. So these Americans are Tunisians.
They are somehow, what is it? Naturalized?
Even if they didn't ask.
No visa application there.
No visa application, it was automatically devastated.
But going back to this Biennale in Liverpool where I made they're unexpected guests.
Yeah, it was.
It was the name of the title of the Biennale.
What's also interesting, I mean, going back now to know, I mean, again, thinking about faces and know and the collective and the visual representation of collectives and how that also somehow, often in the media, stereotypes as well come into play there. You know, often when we think about media representation of the Arab world, it's often, you know, mobs, groups, very few representations of individuals actually that we see in the media.
Bombarded with stereotypes.
Yeah, so I was wondering whether it's also a comment on this somehow as well.
It could be, but I didn't think of it directly when I was doing the work. I mean, it's possible to see it in this extension.
I think especially during the uprisings, you know, I mean, obviously there were many demonstrations, but, you know, there was also this tendency of the media to represent, you know, mobs, groups, you know. I think also if we think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how that's mediatized, Palestinians always are represented in groups.
Yes, that's true, yeah. And even today the media allow to represent a small group like a
big one. Yeah. But that's the thing about the faces especially, because it shows how the technology, the medium of the photography and the scenery, how you dress people and how you do things can give you a completely wrong perspective on something. And unfortunately we are continuing to see the world through this lens of the news, and it can, I notice it from, for example, the conflict more in Ukraine and Russia. I mean, I'm linked to both of these revolutions and the dramas that are happening in both of my countries. But in the Ukrainian case, it was more striking because my mom was living there during Maidan, and she was telling me...
Your mom is Ukrainian.
My mom is Ukrainian and I'm Russian. It's a mixture. Yeah, we're Russian Ukrainian. And she was telling me things living there completely different from what the German media was and the French, whatever, Western media was saying. It's like really diametrically opposite, and she's present there. I'm like, what's happening? No, it's completely different than whatever. So this kind of way of dealing with images and the technology and the media and news didn't change, actually. It's only the technology that changed, but the way we present the reality, it's in the colonial time or today is similar. There's a parallel.
But then later on, it comes out that now many things are coming up. But I remember when your mom said there are Americans distributing muffins on the Maidan. I told Nadia, your mom got crazy.
Yeah, and I thought she's crazy too. And she's like, because it was very cold, and she's like, they have so much money, so much food and drink, and all of these people.
Professional catering.
Yeah, and I don't know where it's coming from. And I'm like, my mom, you're crazy. What are you talking about? These are protesters, and they're really convinced and whatever. They're convinced, yes, but there are some people behind it. And it's not Ukrainian. They don't have that much money. But slowly, all of these things with the time are coming out. So in the Tunisian case, I guess it's very similar. For example, I know it is.
You remember the killing of
Shukri Belaid?
Shukri Belaid. It was when Shukri Belaid was killed.
Is the first political oppositioner in the history of Tunisia, a political murder after the colonialism, because we had one political murder in the time of colonialism, but since the independence, it just happened with the Islamists. The first, and then there was a second.
Yes, and then there was one day, it was the funeral of Shukri Belaid, and I don't know how many people were in the streets for the funeral. Millions, I guess.
I think they felt something like that.
And then the day after, they showed the protest, pro-another protest, so it was pro-Islamist protest
Jazeera.
In Al Jazeera with the images of the day before from the funeral.
From the
so
funeral
see how many
Belaid.
people went to the streets.
And Shukri Belaid, he was a communist, secular, so most of the people, it's who came out, they're not related to absolutely secularism, because this was a shock and drama for all the Tunisian nation. So many people just came out spontaneously. But just how media can recuperate, take images and manipulate them for.
And apparently the argument is always the mass. Show a group, the bigger the group is, the better it is.
So this the mass legitimates. Yeah.
Questions? There's a question over there.
Could you say a little bit about the other work in the gallery with the watchtower, the metal?
That work is titled Modular, in reference to the modular of Le Corbusier, who is the modernist architecture and architect.
Wonderful dynamic here between husband and wife.
Thank you.
He invented the modular as like the module en or.
Yeah, le module en or, so module or. Module is the thing that repeats itself, and the unit that repeats itself, and the or is gold. So the golden module, and taking it the basic that he based his research on the dimension of the human body.
Actually, he based his research on Alfred Hitchcock's novels. That's what I found out, because
so at the end then it became the English measure.
It was the French average size of a handsome tall man, but then he read in Alfred Hitchcock's novels that the hero is always 6 feet tall, and he changed the modular and added 10 centimeters.
Yeah, so this work, what it represents basically, when you see there are thin brass profiles on the floor and on the wall, and they represent the measures of isolation cells in prisons, in different prisons in the world, and it's an ongoing series. This is Modular 2, where we concentrated on prisons in Europe and Israel. There's one from Israel. So somehow this work tends to narrate a part of the modern history of Europe. There is also one of the cells is Buchenwald, the concentration camp.
Which is today a museum, so not an active prison.
Yeah, and then there's the other one where the ex-football...
Uli Hoeneß, he's now sitting in Landsberg am Lech.
And that
because of tax fraud, but Landsberg am Lech was also the prison where Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. So.
And but this work is basically has again many levels and layers, and one of them it talks about the invisible walls that surround us in our everyday life. So we took the reference to Le Corbusier because of the idea of making a space efficient. Big enough to be comfortable, but also small enough to put a maximum of people in the same space. And this idea of making our life efficient, for example, reference to the 9-to-5 job and doing things to maximize your time and using your phone and whatever, but at the same time have time to eat, but eat while walking and whatever, is a kind of getting into this invisible walls also, or invisible prisons. And by extrapolation, if you try to get out of this invisible prison, it's possible that you would get into a concrete prison, because we're also normalized and Kafkaesque again, all along the watchtower.
But it's something that is interesting. I realized it yesterday by chance. Just I didn't pay attention to it, but maybe if you see the exhibition, you will understand what I mean. When you see the installation and you see the outlines in brass lying in front of you, and you then step inside, you feel like being inside of something, even if there are no walls and there's no reason to be inside of something. But you are mentally already tuned to a limited space that you feel a little bit. Yeah, it's crazy. But this is what Nadia is always working about, this invisible things that you can not get by visual experiences. It's more like a feeling. So and this installation makes it quite clear how your brain is working and your perception. So it makes you feel like being in a confinement situation.
The feeling of unease is not evident. Often it's like when someone looking at you at the back and you don't really know there's something going wrong.
Any more questions?
I suppose an observation more than it was very interesting. I suppose I'm interested in if anybody else sort of had that feeling when the piece what struck me was, because you've actually isolated every question, there's an emphasis based on it, and ultimately I couldn't help but feel every single time a statement was made, are you a terrorist, have you done this? I kept thinking of the leaders. I kept thinking of Bush and of Blair and of all of these people who actually were the ones that have been doing all of these things. And otherwise, you look through it and you go, oh, for goodness sake, and then you start laughing maybe. But because of the way in which you separated it all, it gives the chance to actually literally listen very, very clearly to every single question. I don't know whether that's just my twisted mind or other people's.
Yes, there's one question. Have you ever had ideas of or thought about committing terrorist acts?
Are you asking me?
Are you really? Of course I do. Every time when I do my text report, I think of this.
But this is also to do with the sort of the notion.
But it's okay, you're German, and I don't know if you're UK.
Yeah, I don't need a visa, that's cool. So I can go to the UK.
These thoughts. You're not on the acts of evil. It's not my case.
There's always somewhere that you will get questions.
Yes,
when
of
I go
course.
to the States, for sure, you get questions about it because we require a visa.
Absolutely, but this case, all along the watchtower, this is my aim, I wish it's like this, to start from a very particular situation, really from this contact, and aiming to get into something universal, because there are some kind of, unfortunately, there are loops, things that repeat themselves, and you can find the same in a completely different context, but in the same model, that is modules repeating themselves.
Mainly Western, perhaps.
I live in the Western world, so this is also, again, this paradox, often put in the Arabic box, but I know much more about the Western since I live more than half of my life here. So my work is more about what's surrounding me, my everyday life, and it's the Western world.
Yes.
Not
But I think that by doing that, there's a reflection.
But there's also again this the Arabic or African, because I am here as also a Tunisian who's confronted to this kind of questions, issues.
Okay. Can I, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Extraordinary stories, and you were talking about the visible and the invisible and what you've brought out this evening just with your sort of exchanges. Timo, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much
Nadia,
for having us here.
for drawing everything out. Thank you very much indeed, and I think I've been to see the show. I want to go and see it again after this evening. We've all got to get there by the end of Saturday. So,
I hope to see you at Mosaic Rooms.
Thank you.
Thank you.